I want to thank you for letting me come and talk with you, because it's really been very interesting. This is a project, when you see the pieces of it, I'll try to explain it, that has gone over the last 30 years, and yet in this last week, I felt it speed up. And part of that was the privilege of being able to come and talk with you. And already it's become a communal project. The person actually who provided the image for my talk, Virginia Woolf's birth mother, is Vanessa. And I'll maybe mention her, Vanessa Crook. I was in her office another time when we were talking about something that's hopefully going to come up in the talk about privatizing Christianity and the dangers of it. And so I owe her a double tribute. But I just wanted to treat this chronologically, and it's been, as I said, over at least the last 30 years, because it started with my dissertation and multiple rewritings of my dissertation on Virginia Woolf, post-impressionist art, and phenomenology. When I got ready to write a dissertation, I somehow wanted to do one that would teach me a lot, and I knew a tiny bit about philosophy because I'd been a double major at Wheaton and taken 7 courses with Dr. Holmes. And so I pretty much majored in Arthur Holmes, who was a British empiricist there at the school. And then I also knew very little about art. And when I started reading Virginia Woolf, I found out that her mentor and the mentor of the Bloomsbury group was an art critic named Roger Fry. And Roger Fry brought post-impressionist art into England in 1910 in an exhibit. And by post-impressionist art, he really meant Cézanne, because whereas Impressionism is a school and many of the artists share similarities, post-impressionism was a clump of artists that went multiple ways, and it was Cézanne that Roger Fry was most fascinated by. And it was also Roger Fry who was her friend for 25 years, her aesthetic mentor, and who she then ultimately wrote a biography about, which gives a legitimate tie between Virginia Woolf and Cézanne. On the other hand, there's no tie at all between Virginia Woolf and Merleau-Ponty. That was something that I provided completely because I didn't understand what I was seeing in Virginia Woolf until I read The Phenomenology of Perception. So I'll try to give you the guides in, a little bit about the post-impressionist art. Cézanne was, what's really interesting, just in this last week, I was traveling for a memorial service and came across a Cézanne painting, but I don't know if you can see it well enough. It was an early painting, and it was done probably in the 1876 or so. And it's a scene of just people enjoying the outdoors. What's distinctive about it is that they are spatially connected, and you can see this line of a tree that goes through it. If you look at post-impressionist art and looking at Cézanne, you will notice that the figures are inextricably connected, that they're not only connected with each other, but they're connected with their background. Background and foreground are spatially interconnected. If you compare that, for instance, if you look at an impressionist painting like one of Renoir's of a woman, and then compare it with a Cézanne painting of a woman, you'll see the marked difference. With Cézanne, he is lining her up with the lines of that door, with the line of the coffee pot, with the line of the spoon, the line in her dress. Everything is spatially connected and interconnected. In a way like this, except you see in a very early version of it with just the tree lining and the groups of people on each side. That's very different than the Renoir painting. The Impressionists were trying to get a hold of the sensations that met their eyes in one instantaneous moment. And probably all of you have seen these series of Monet's haystacks, or a series of Renoir's Rouen Cathedral, in which the Impressionist is really just trying to capture a fleeting moment of time by giving you the sensation of color that observer's eye that was aware of. And it is really what in the medium of literature when Ford Madox Ford and Conrad were trying to do some of the same thing, featuring the observer unapologetically. Have you read Heart of Darkness? And you watch Marlowe and his observations being the whole of the novel. And with very little apologies for that. Ford Madox Ford called Impressionism in literature a frank expression of ego. But the trick with a frank expression of ego is you may end up all alone. And so you hear Marlowe, who is such a wise, measured, active in many ways, as well as reflective individual, being very pessimistic about reality. And he says early on in the novel, no, it's impossible. It's impossible to convey the life sensation of any given epoch of one's existence, that which makes its truth, its meaning, its subtle and penetrating essence. It is impossible. We live as we dream alone. And there is that dark side of Impressionism, which is that you may find out that in being so mesmerized by your own world and as the observer's impressions, that you may find yourself isolated and alone. The Romantics and the Impressionists were brave souls. They didn't seem to be too threatened by that. Virginia Woolf really clung to a larger world, a world that could give her ballast. And what strikes me is wonderful about her novels is that she walks in to a large life world, and she takes joy in the flight of rooks, in a bowl of fruit on the table, on the pampas grass along the coast. She's just very much aware of what the life world is offering her. And I didn't understand fully what I was seeing, as I said, until I read Merleau-Ponty. And this is not true of her early novels. What I'm talking about now primarily is in her most mature vision. Eudora Welty, when she's talking about To the Lighthouse, said that what we're getting here is something beyond being about the very nature of reality. It's a vision of reality. In some ways, Virginia Woolf is trying to capture the way she sees. And the reason why I was interested in her is because she seemed to me part of a fabric of the 20th century, woven out of some of the finest minds of particularly the earlier part of the century. And these minds came from science, those folks who were looking at energistic physics and quantum physics and saw things in terms of interrelationships instead of a mechanistic world. And they also, Virginia Woolf, who was very much aware of life in terms of interrelationships between people, not primarily as the isolated observer looking out there at an already defined, already fixed world. Like the realist would come along and they would be able to tell you a story from first to last, giving the motivations of a character, giving you a pretty much predefined world. The impressionist would come along and they would give you a world that was not defined at all, that was mysterious, filled with a atmospheric aura, but where you at least were standing next to this solid observer, sometimes not so solid if you're reading Ford Madox Ford's The Good Soldier, but but at least the observer is featured, and that's where you stand. That's where you gain your ballast. But Virginia Woolf invites us into a space-time continuum, particularly spatial continuum, and has us walk through a setting and to absorb what's out there. And it sounds like it's not a novel. And in fact, it is not a conventional novel. I'm always mystified and amazed when my students fall deeply in love with Virginia Woolf because it's so not the conventional novel. For instance, in To the Lighthouse, she just walks people and sometimes brings people. The central figures in the first chunk, the first 60, 80 pages, are the mother and child, Mrs. Ramsay and James, 6-year-old James. But Mr. Ramsay walks back and forth. They're sitting at the drawing room window. But Mr. Ramsay is walking back and forth on the terrace with his friend Charles Tansley, and all of them are interlinked in this space. She basically brings people in and out of each other's presence and space, having them react to each other, but also having them take up the spatial setting, and that's the novel. It doesn't have a conventional storyline. And it has this amazing sense of a vision of reality that includes a community of people that are all interlocked and interlaced, and that are responding to each other often very astutely, very often very acutely, and are able to pick up each other's signals and interact to this world in which they are inextricably interconnected, and which they are also have access to a spatial world in a much more real way. For instance, Lily Briscoe is painting a picture of Mrs. Ramsay and of James. And she then decides she drops her painting for a minute and starts walking with William Banks, who is a rather dry widower, but sensitive, and doesn't crush her artistic sensibility. She trusts him to see her pictures. And as they are walking, they come along and see Cam, who is one of the daughters of Mr. and Mrs. Ramsay. And then Jasper shoots off his air gun, and a flight of starlings rises to the sky. And at the same time, Mr. Ramsay, who's in his own personal, often abstract, but at this point he's quoting Tennyson's Charge of the Light Brigade, someone has blundered, and he comes around the corner, and he sees them, and the rooks fly up, and Jasper passes, and Mr. Ramsay shuts his emotional door and moves on, and leaving William Banks and Lily just walking on their way. It's one of those very Virginia Woolf moments where everybody is brought together in a spatial setting. Probably the largest in that first chunk is when they sit, 15 of them, around a dinner table. And Mrs. Ramsay is particularly concerned that they all merge around that dinner table, or brought together around the dinner table, which ultimately happens after there's a great deal of emotional give and take between these characters, what each one thinks of the others, and how they're relating to feeling distanced from the community and then brought into the community. Signals that go between husband and wife, Mr. and Mrs. Ramsay. But it's all in terms of this spatial setting around the dinner table. And when, in fact, the moment culminates after 30 pages, they are just brought together in the candlelight around this gorgeous bowl of fruit, around the dinner that they were eating, around the marriage that is the sort of the parameter of this scene. And there's a sense of deep satisfaction for Mrs. Ramsay particularly, that everyone is intermeshed. And then as she leaves the room, the scene dissolves. And the moment that she had of connection has to be rebuilt in the next moment. So the vision that she has of interrelated reality is in some ways very reassuring, because there is a life world out there into which she can interact. But then it also dissolves and has to be rebuilt at every moment. Let me just read you a few excerpts from this book by Merleau-Ponty, The Phenomenology of Perception. And I think you can see from what I said why this helps for me to understand what she's doing. He talks about what he calls the life world, and he says that life world, actually Heidegger talked about it in other contexts as phusis, the power of emergence, that there is a reality out there for you and for me that exists pre-analytically, pre-cognitively, and it is the power of emergence in the universe. And that means that you're not in the act of creation, you're not in the act of meaning making all by yourself. The world itself is there to come and collaborate with you and cooperate with you. But you need a body to do that. You need a body to step in to that world. And this is what Merleau-Ponty talks about. He says, although atomistic structures of the empiricist appear more real than organic forms, they are not. And we must begin immersed in experience of the life world before even the empiricist's mental abstractions gain meaning. Merleau-Ponty was trying to do something that Dr. Holmes alerted me to as an undergraduate. He would draw a line that came like this. I don't know if I have a big enough piece of chalk. He would draw a line for the rationalists And then he would draw a line for the empiricist movement, and he would say there's almost no meeting between them. He would root it and talk about it in terms of the split away between the thinking subject and the objective world that has existed long before Cartesian dualism, but was really brought into strong cultural, I think, popularity or cultural acceptance with the Enlightenment. And what happens is, he made me aware as an undergraduate that we are really eating the fruits of the Enlightenment that splits the thinking subject away from the objective world. That consequently, it's very hard to, we live in dualisms between mind and body, between faith and science, and it's very hard to find any way of thinking that can bridge that dualism. And Merleau-Ponty, in the Phenomenology of Perception, is one of those thinkers that, for me, bridged that dualism. And I think Virginia Woolf, in her novels, also bridges the dualism. Because she takes her body and walks in to a spatial setting. Let me just read a couple of these quotations, because and if by any chance you're interested in 13 pages of notes from the Phenomenology of Perception, taken many years ago, this was a book that shaped my world. It helped me to re-see the world, possibility of a way of looking at reality, which I'll tell you in just a few minutes has to do with the way I'm trying to rethink theology, which is why Virginia Woolf ultimately and Merleau-Ponty have been very crucial for me in the long run. But what he says about the, he's trying to redefine, he talks about rationalism and empiricism in terms of intellectualism and sensationalism, but essentially he's talking about the same split. And he said both of those are dependent on mental constructs that really don't take advantage of this life world, this wonderful precognitive reality into which we can live, in which we can step for moments of meaning. Anyway, he says, intellectualism looks only at the preconditions of perception rather than the operation which brings it into reality. And he's talking about the body and says that that the body it says, the basis of existential, he conceives of our body as our anchorage in the world, our general medium for having a world, and then talks about space as Merleau-Ponty sees space not as the merely geometrical setting in which things are arranged, but rather as the means whereby the positing of things becomes possible, the universal power enabling them to be connected. It's this capacity for connection that is what I want to think about and what I want to stress. Because I think that what's happened to Christendom, and at least what I feel the pressures on inside myself, is how do I get beyond what R.D. Laing called our skin-encapsulated egos. And it seems to me that, that one of the big legacies of the Enlightenment is that it's very difficult for us to do that. Because unless we rethink reality and think that reality isn't necessarily splitting the observing self off from the atomistic world and trying to control the world, threatening our identities, and our identities being pretty isolated from the rest of reality, it's really hard for us to live in a creative and in a connected sort of way. The work that I've been trying to do, I didn't understand at all, and maybe I don't fully understand yet what the connection is between Virginia Woolf, what it was for me between Virginia Woolf and my faith. Because here was a secular thinker who didn't talk about God at all. When she did, we just were reading it into the Lighthouse. A small group of us are working with it. When she did into the Lighthouse, there's a moment when she's looking at, Mrs. Ramsey, is looking at a beam of light that's coming out of the lighthouse. And she's allowed herself to sort of sink down into a state of reverie. And she looks at that beam of the lighthouse as it comes across the water. And she says, "We're in the Lord's hands." And then she comes to consciousness and said, that's a lie. I can't accept that. And when we were talking about it this last week, I saw that as Mrs. Ramsey's surely rejection of Christianity, of God, of theism. But I also saw it as perhaps Virginia Woolf's as well. I've always sensed in her a mystic without one to unify all these things that she's experiencing. But in fact, I thought, this week, it may be that it's in those moments of the precognitive, pre-analytical world where she senses the unity of the underlying nature of reality, and she really does temporarily feel in the Lord's hands. It was sort of a reversal of the way I'd been, and we'd been interpreting that passage. Anyway, what happened for me is about a decade after I finished Virginia Woolf, I started wondering if I should rethink my theology. Because since Wheaton, my faith had grown, my worship had grown, but my theology really hadn't. It was really on a child level. I hadn't ever gone back through all of Scripture and tried to rethink it. And so I was in Vienna at the time, we were in Vienna, and part of a little Methodist church. And I was asked to talk about my understanding of the cross. So even though with Virginia Woolf, my dissertation topic was the anonymous self, and it hinged around the way she saw herself as a part of a whole fabric of interrelating personalities rather than as the huge ego. When I started with theology, it was with the cross. What is the significance of the cross? What's the meaning of the cross? And what I started thinking about was that probably or possibly that the cross needs to be understood fundamentally in terms of what it offers, what God is offering for connection with Him. That when we look at the cross and approach it theologically, primarily as, when we talk about, for instance, atonement, as substitutionary atonement for guilt, rather than at one-ment with God, that if we don't get to the relational aspect, if we don't root our theology in God's phenomenal capacity to be related to man, and his deep, deep desire to be related to man, we somehow tilt the meaning of the cross. We somehow fail to understand the full meaning of the cross. You can talk about reparation as reparation payments, or you can talk about it as being repaired. You can talk about atonement as substitutionary atonement for guilt, payment for guilt, and that's all a huge part of the legal framework of the Old Testament, and it's a blessed part. I would this week was looking at Exodus and looking at the guilt offering that the poor man pays. And the guilt offering that the poor man paid, as I saw it, was a pigeon with its neck wrenched, but not totally severed, the head not totally severed from the body. And I said, wow. To live in that, in terms of what the cost is of separation from God, is phenomenally huge. But what struck me, and it struck me in the last several years when I've been thinking about the cross and about God's nature, is that primarily when God comes into history, He comes to give Himself. And that if we don't understand that at the crux of the cross, that He came, that God came, to be with us in our greatest poverty. He saw that the cost of not somehow making reconnection with mankind was phenomenal loss of life. That image of the pigeon with its wrenched neck and the not completely severed head is a picture of the cost of sin, which eventuates in death. And has great appeal to me. I moved from the sense of the cross and to understanding that all of these parts of our theology are rooted in the nature of God Himself. And I can't possibly grab a hold of the nature of God Himself, but what has struck me with a force that I never saw as a younger person was that God is profoundly relational. I love the passage, the story in Genesis 15, when Abram, is told to cut the covenant with God. He wants to know for sure if he can have a child or not. And he's told to cut the covenant with God. And he's very explicitly takes a 3-year-old ram, a 3-year-old goat, a 3-year-old heifer, a pigeon, and a dove, and the bodies of the animals are severed in half and put in, on this outside. And he, before he actually is spoken to by God, is overwhelmed with horror, and so much that he falls asleep and has part of the revelation of God while he is asleep. And then when it says that he, when darkness had fallen, there appeared a smoking furnace and a blazing torch that went between the halves of the dead animal bodies. And I have this Jerusalem Bible that I happen to love, and I looked over at the note, and it said, in the ancient ritual of covenant, the two parties to a contract walked between the halves of a dead animal and called down on themselves the fate of the victim if they should violate the agreement. Here, the blazing torch symbolizes Yahweh. So I thought, woof, because Abram doesn't walk through those broken animal bodies. It is God himself who comes as a smoking furnace and a blazing torch and says, if this covenant cannot be kept, I will be broken. It's the most phenomenal picture of willingness to be present to us, of relationship. I was sitting with my friend Rosemary this week, who is a pastor, a chaplain in a prison, a women's prison in New York, and who is married to another pastor who has, within the last year and a half, had an affair with one of his interns, has left the home, and who has left her with one adopted child with some difficulties and a foster child with immense difficulties. He was just hospitalized last night, or 2 nights ago, because he was trying to kill himself. He may have been sexually abused by his family before. And Rosemary and I were sitting in Starbucks, and I said, can you imagine anybody who would want to reside inside the muck of your life with you, every single bit of it, let alone the muck of my life, every single bit of it? And God chooses to reside inside all of our traumas, all of our relational upheavals, all of our challenges, all of our joys, and he multiplies that by millions and billions. Can you imagine what a relational God that is? It blows me away. And so one of the things that struck me and that helped me with Virginia Woolf is to think of what are the implications for self. If God is so relational, what does that mean for us? And there was a woman, a very wise woman, in the DC school system. So she taught there for about 40 years. And she said every era of Christians, in every era, Christendom has its heresy that it must contend with. And she said, our heresy in our era is individualism. And what happens if you really don't find a way to bridge between individuals, and if you start, it can be conceptually, but it's primarily in terms of our daily lives. We live in a culture which finds nothing wrong with our being a skin-encapsulated ego. That's a term that R.D. Laing used years ago in the 60s, 70s, in a little book called The Divided Self. But it really is a problem for us in Christendom. It's a colossal problem. And because we tend to think that it's all right. In fact, we accept, almost without question, what the world tells us, that it's our responsibility to define ourselves, and we have to protect at all risk our self-actualization. And we think, even as Christians, we think that us as a continuum of people in the natural world, even in the spiritual world with the body of Christ, that it tends to, we think of it as a metaphor instead of the reality. But Virginia Woolf clued me in to the fact that there's nobody that we get onto if we get onto the metro, there's nobody that we approach that we're not connected with. There's nobody that we're not affecting when we get on the metro. There's nobody in any moment in our classroom, any moment that we have interchange with people, we're all interlinked spatially, physically, and we forget that we really have a lot of power in some ways, although it's very small in any given moment, but we are interconnected. That's just on a physical level. That's her vision just on a natural level. And we have trouble even with the supernatural revelation of God in Christ and all that he told us, which is, I'm only going to give you one commandment. Be related to me, to God, with all your heart, soul, strength, and mind, and be related to other people like you are to yourself, that intimately, that closely. He only gave us one, and we muff it. I muff it constantly. And it's because I keep thinking of myself as isolated. I keep thinking of myself as predefined. I keep thinking of myself out of process in some sort of, or if in process, only a process this way. And this was where Vanessa's comment, and interestingly, Jim Wallace said the same thing this morning, for those of you who heard him, that there's a danger, there's a difference between privatizing Christianity and personalizing it. And I think that our tendency, when we get to be the isolated ego, we are inevitably privatizing it. And his call, his pull was to live out Matthew 25, as you have done it unto the least of these, my brethren, you've done it unto me. To understand this phenomenal interconnection that we have with everybody whose lives we are spatially connected with, which is a lot of people, and even those who we, within a spiritual realm, are not spatially connected with, we can reach in prayer. So there's this tremendous web of humanity that we have the opportunity of moving into and interacting with if we can only take it up. But the interesting thing, it's not only, I think, that is, what struck me this week was that not only applies to human relations, but it applies to our relation with the world. In the same way that Virginia Woolf didn't want to be out there alone, creating, trying just in her own self to engender all of the meaning that she had, it struck me that maybe the world that God created is a world that's set up for interrelationships, that's set up for love, that if we were aware of it, that there is a lot more interconnection in the universe, even in the physical universe, than we understand. And some of modern science, to me, seems to have put their finger on that, on the interconnections, in a way that the mechanistic science of Newton didn't do, when it just saw things in the world as objects that were being bombarded and being manipulated. Instead, some of modern science, and I'm speaking out of my element here, but the little I understand is pulling me because it says there's complementarity, there is a relationship, the theory of relativity, there are all sorts of things that we don't understand about the physical world that are much more inviting to the Christian than we have yet grabbed a hold of. I think that's true in literary criticism, too. I know very little, as Anne knows, very little about literary criticism, but I'm getting excited about deconstructors and thinking that life flows simultaneously in multiple directions at the same time. Because if you think about any human being that you know, your mother, somebody that you love a lot, or somebody that you know very, very, very well, try to say who they are, and you can't do it because they inevitably flow multiple directions simultaneously at the same time, as does every great text. That doesn't reduce us to not being able to say anything about them, and it doesn't mean that certain things can't be said that are privileged over other things, but there is this great sense of fluidity and excitement about the world. One thing I would love for myself as a Christian, besides getting beyond thinking that my life is more important than your life, in other words, being in my skin-encapsulated ego, is to also be able to approach moral issues with some of the complexity of even a George Eliot or a Henry James, because they see that life flows multiple directions simultaneously, and they're able to understand that you can't pin down a moral act by thinking you've identified it with a word, pride, for instance, which can be a good thing or a bad thing, or self-sacrifice, which can be a good thing or a bad thing, or good and bad. One of the things that struck me, I had a conversation last night with a couple of people who graduated a few years ago, and Eric asked, well, what are you thinking about the nature of sin? And when I was working with this idea about the cross being relational, primarily relational, not exclusively relational, but unless we understand God's phenomenal desire to be with us, we can't understand the cross. And unless we can understand that he actually changed the nature of death by entering into it. Our greatest poverty was the fact that we have no life force in us, that we, separated from him, die. And I started thinking about sin as an extension of the way Augustine thinks about it. Augustine talks about sin metaphysically as privation, just the absence of goodness, absence of God, which makes sense if you want to end up with a world in which only God is, we don't have a dualistic world. And I thought, if that's the case, maybe sin is departure from God. And if sin is departure from God, that can come with the lure of the good as well as the lure of the bad. In fact, most often, for most of us in this room, sin does come through the lure of the good, something that is less than God, but is beautiful, that we can give ourselves to, and then somehow it's not as large as God. And if we're used to thinking in terms of having captured moral realities by a bounded word, instead of understanding that morality comes in our contextual relationships with life, with each other, with ourselves, we get into big trouble, I think, in Christendom. And that's another area that I would like to be able to retrain my thinking and see a little bit more. The way Virginia Woolf and Merleau-Ponty helped me to re-see the world in a natural way, but applying it to the supernatural. When I go to my little church, which I love, and they're wonderful, wonderful believers there, I get so sometimes frustrated by the I choruses that come across our screen. I. And I can respond to that by substituting I for we, which I'm now doing softly instead of loudly. Initially, I was being a little loud about it. So I pulled back a little bit on that one, but that doesn't really help us too much from the damage that we do within Christendom from privatizing our faith, making it all God and me, and making it really not very relational with other people, surely the unbelieving world, but not even believers, not even really taking the metaphor, which is more than a metaphor, of the body of Christ seriously, so that we are inextricably intermeshed. And what happens to Jesse happens to me. You know, until that comes, somehow I'm not living as Christ would have me live. And there's such a huge distance between where I'm living and where I want to go. But where I want Christendom to go, too, because we have gotten into a lot of trouble, judging people, dissing people, holding our faith as though it's our own rather than the God of this phenomenal capacity for relationship. So what I'm not saying is that we have to choose an either or. I'm a both and kind of person. It's not that we have to choose whether or not we're going to talk about atonement as our relational, hugely relational capacity of the cross to reach through to mankind and redefine death and eventually redefine sin. One of the things redefine sin. Because one of the things I found when I was reading, I don't generally read Christian books, but I read after I'd been working on the cross and my conception of the cross for a while, I read Stott's book on the cross, and I was shocked that he left out the resurrection, that he didn't talk about the saving power of the death and resurrection of Christ. And I don't know how we're going to deal with sin, really sin, on an ongoing way, unless we enter the resurrection and are rechanged in this ongoing connection with God, who breathes life into us in spite of our pulling back and our departures. Yeah. I'm all for seeing the resurrection as the objective reality of Christ having risen from the dead. That's huge. That's fundamental. Dr. Holmes said that your Christian hope, I'll send you to 1 Corinthians 15 as he sent me to 1 Corinthians 15. Your Christian hope is the resurrection body. And one of the things that I was slow to pick up on at Wheaton and afterwards is the phenomenal importance of our body. That it is through the body that we live into the world and that we shape people. And if we give up our body, if we give up our chance of interacting with people and with interacting with ourselves and becoming whole. And that's why what Jim Wallace is talking about in terms of reaching out to the world of the physical world of pain is such a huge dimension of Christendom and a place where we are going. He talked today about Rick Warren having all of a sudden seen that there were 2,000 verses about the poor in the Bible. And this is a place where we are being pulled, even as evangelicals. I'm so thankful. But so what I'm not saying is that you have to choose between the individual, the self as individual and the self as community. I just say that there are all sorts of ways that finding some interface between the kind of mechanism and atomism, egoism that we've been fed as children of the Enlightenment is a mandate, is a necessity for us as believers. We can't just uncritically and accept what has caused us to think in very limited terms about the self and about not only the self as a natural phenomenon, but the self as a supernatural phenomenon. So I wanted to open this up to questions and see, I thought, I can't take all this time when we're talking about connections and inner community. I cannot take up the whole time for myself. So please, any kind of questions that you've got? David.